Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kevin O'Brien, and I'm coming to you from PLU's Division of Humanities. Let me begin by acknowledging that the PLU campus is on the traditional territories of the Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, and Steilacoom peoples, who've lived on and cared for this land as their ancestral home since time immemorial. As we continue in this symposium thinking about health in a global context, we want to be sure to honor the commitment to healthy land, water, and community that has been shown by its traditional caretakers. This is the first of two sessions that will draw on the expertise of Pacific Lutheran University's own faculty. This one's entitled Healing in the Disciplines and is going to draw from scholars of anthropology, literature, and religion to reflect on the complexity and the importance of understanding health and healing from multiple perspectives. My role is to introduce each speaker, which I'll do in turn. They're going to present in alphabetical order. And as they speak, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions in writing. If there's time within each speaker's allotment, I'll be happy to give them a chance to answer questions directly about their talks, but then also we will definitely have time at the end to bring in some of those questions and perhaps connect presentations with those questions. So please do use the Q&A anytime. Now I'm going to turn to introduce the first of our speakers, who's Dr. Suzanne Crawford O'Brien. Dr. Crawford O'Brien is Professor of Religion, Chair of Native and Indigenous Studies, and Interim Dean of Interdisciplinary Programs here at PLU. It's important to say, while her last name is a lot like mine, we aren't related, though I would be proud if we were. Suzanne's research focuses on health, wellness, and ecological justice in North American Indigenous communities. She has particular expertise and has done extensive ethnographic and community-based work with the Salish peoples of Western Washington. The title of her talk is An Interdisciplinary Approach to Health, Healing, and Religious Cultural Diversity. So I'll turn it to Suzanne.
Hello there. Hi. So I'm going to be talking a bit about how approaching health and wellness functions in my scholarship and also in my teaching. So in order to do that, I want to talk about first one example of some research I've done and then also talk about one of my classes. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and hopefully this will work all right. Okay. So just thinking about some of my work, I want to start out with a story because I think stories work well. And I'm going to tell you the story of a young woman named Ellen Gray. This is not a picture of Ellen Gray, and there's actually, we can have a whole conversation about why this is a bad picture, which I think kind of relates to some of the things I want to talk about. This picture was actually taken 30 years after Ellen Gray's life, and it's problematic. It's both beautiful and problematic. It's an Edward Curtis image, and he used highly stylized and kind of nostalgic imagery to represent Indigenous people. So she, in this particular image, this young woman is wearing clothes that wouldn't have been worn in 1912, but would have been valued artifacts and valued treasures within a family. So she's showing some of her family's treasures. But this is a relative of Ellen Gray, the young woman I want to talk about, not a descendant, but a relative. The individual on the other side of the screen is Reverend Myron Ells, and he's the one who recorded this story that I want to tell you about. So Ellen Gray, according to Myron Ells, was a 16-year-old girl. She grew up just down the road from PLU, not far from here. She was a member of the Tswana-Skokomish Nation, and she was attending a boarding school not far from here in the Shelton area. Myron Ells ran that boarding school, and as we know, if you perhaps know, there's a very complicated and very traumatic history around residential boarding schools. This comes from Myron Ells's notebooks. He writes, Ellen Gray was a schoolgirl, about 16 years of age, and had been in the boarding school at Skokomish for several years, nearly ever since she was old enough to attend. On Saturday, the 1st of January, 1881, she was taken sick. Her parents and friends made her believe that a bad spirit had been put into her, and no one but an Indian doctor could cure her. The agent, the Indian agent at the time, was Myron Ells, Edward Ells's brother. The two of them governed the territory almost exclusively. The agent took charge of her, moved her into a quote-unquote decent house nearby, and put white watchers over her so that the proper medicines would be given and no Indian doctor brought in. She was locked away, isolated from her family, who were not allowed to see her. Reverend Els describes her distress. She refused to take the medicines they prescribed. She was angry. She would scream in frustration. And then he concludes, until one night, she threw off her clothes, took cold, and would not make any effort to cough or clear her throat. And on the 22nd, she died, actually choking to death. What's vividly clear in his narrative is that Els had no cultural reference for understanding her illness. He had no empathy for her personal distress or for her family's pain at being forcibly separated from their child. He expressed no regrets for a colonial system that outlawed Indigenous religions and healing traditions, and no comprehension of the damage inflicted on a young woman in such a context. Instead, he concludes the story with his own diagnosis. He writes, quote, "It was a tolerably clear case of death from imagination." In doing so, he placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of a young 16-year-old girl. This story inspired my dissertation. It inspired the monograph that I wrote. And over 20 years later, I continue to think about Ellen Gray. I continue to think about how her story was silenced and how her perspective was lost. But I also want to tell you another story that frames my experience as well. This one starts in 1976 with the American Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. This act paved the way for tribal communities to reclaim control of their schools and their health care. They were able to contract with the federal government to open up and manage their own tribal schools and their own health and wellness centers. This provided a means to an alternative path, an alternative to Indian Health Service hospitals, which were the only other alternative at the time, which were large, regional, highly bureaucratic, and chronically underfunded hospitals and health clinics that seemed to be designed to be as unwelcoming as possible if Native people's own perspectives are to be taken seriously. The Puyallup tribe, just down the road from us, was the first in the nation to do this work. The Skokomish, Ellen Gray's people, followed soon after, as did other tribes in Western Washington. And that became the other focus of my dissertation research back in the day, was to see how these new wellness centers, and new 20 years ago now, were really taking shape. And in particular, how they were designing their health and wellness centers in a way that explicitly encompassed, valued, and included Indigenous perspectives on what it means to be sick, to be well, and how to get people well in community. These were spaces that respected Indigenous worldviews, their understandings of illness, and gave pathways for wellness. These were the kinds of places that were not available to Ellen Gray. So these two stories then became that frame for my monograph it's called Coming Full Circle, Spirituality and Wellness Among Native Communities in the Northwest. And I wanted to include them here both because they were and are the inspirational stories behind why I started doing what I'm doing. And also because I think they help to understand why interdisciplinarity and intersectionality are two such important things to consider. And really, if I was to choose two words that really define my method, that's it. Interdisciplinarity and intersectionality. Because you can't understand Ellen Gray's story. You can't understand the full significance of a small tribal community opening their own wellness center without doing that interdisciplinarity work. Right? You have to understand the historical context of colonialism. And that requires time in archives. And that requires time reading a lot of historical work, reading oral narratives, and listening to those voices and trying to uncover the voices that have been lost. You also can't understand those stories if you don't think about philosophical and epistemological worldviews, the worldviews of the Coast Salish people, and also the worldviews of Congregationalist 19th century missionaries. What were those worldviews? How did they come into conflict? How did they differ? How have those worldviews changed over time? It also required a lot of ethnographic work. So I was also doing community field work where I was hanging out in wellness centers and hanging out at women's wellness retreats, and doing a lot of just being there with people. I often say my ethnographic method is washing dishes. I think you just get in the kitchen and start washing dishes. People know why you're there, and if they want to tell you things, they'll tell you. So I was never one for much of formal recorded interviews, because that wasn't really welcome in those communities, and it wouldn't have felt appropriate to do interviews in that way. So just wash the dishes. So that interdisciplinary approach, that it requires history, it requires ethnography, and it requires really that kind of deep philosophical analysis as well. And then it really requires an intersectional perspective. So to think about Ellen Gray's story, right, it's not just a sad anecdote that should make us sigh and feel sad, but it's also this really deeply revealing moment about how gender and race and ethnicity and religion and age all shape people's access to power. And it shapes their access to healthcare, and it shapes their agency over their bodies, their ability to control their own bodies. So my scholarship and the kind of work I do is informed by all those concerns. And then I also carry that methodology over into my classes. So I wanted to take a couple minutes just to show you what that looks like in the classroom setting. So during fall of 2020, in the height of the pandemic, I had the opportunity to teach a class, an upper division seminar on health, wellness, and religious and cultural diversity. And so in that seminar, each unit focused on intersectionality and the importance of that interdisciplinary approach within a different cultural group. So each unit in the class started with an epidemiological studies to think about how issues of gender, sexuality, race, and religious identity shaped a particular group's understanding of mental health in particular, and their access to care. So we looked at that epidemiological studies, kind of understanding as much as we could the current context. What are the ailments that that community is particularly vulnerable to? Why? What do we know about why? What's their access to care? What are the resources? What is that broad kind of picture? And then we went very deep in one particular person's memoir so that we could understand one person within that community and what their story looked like. So, for instance, we started out by reading excerpts from Shaniqua Walker Barnes's book, Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength. Such an incredible book. I highly, highly recommend it. And then we read Monica Coleman's memoir, Bipolar Faith, The Black Woman's Journey with Depression and Faith. So to really kind of understand that work. Then we looked at the experience of the Latinx community. We read some epidemiological studies about access to mental health care for primarily Mexican American, but including other Latino communities within the United States. And then looked at Alicia Ochoa Torres' book, Curandero, A Life in Mexican Folk Healing, to think about what are those alternative pathways toward physical and mental health care that we can find in this community. We read epidemiological studies about mental health care and mental illness among a variety of Asian American communities, and really talked about how those communities are so very, very diverse and have very, very different experiences of this. We looked at studies that consider the efficacy of mindfulness and meditation in mental health care. And then we read Dr. Sharon Suh's book, Occupy This Body, who we just heard from, and now you all know how wonderful she is. It was such a wonderful thing. It was so great to see her. We looked at epidemiological studies about Native American health and mental health care, and we read Joy Harjo's memoir, Crazy Brave. The blessings of Zoom meant that we were able to have some incredible guest speakers as well as part of this time. So Dr. Suh joined us for our class. Dr. Monica Coleman joined us for a class and talked with our students. My dear friend, Dr. Dennis Kelly, joined us and talked about the role of Indigenous religious traditions in recovery from alcohol abuse and for folks recovering from the traumas of domestic violence. And then Megan Corby, who is now Megan Phillips, a PLU alum, came and spoke with us about her experiences being a hospital chaplain and what that is like and what that work is like. This particular seminar was primarily made up of students in the social work, nursing, and religion programs. And so it was really, really neat to have these students, all of whom see themselves into going into helping and caring professions, and to experience this kind of work together. So all of this work, I want to say, whether it's my class or my scholarship, really builds on kind of a classic voice in this conversation. Dr. Arthur Kleinman Many of you have heard of him. He wrote the book, The Illness Narratives, kind of a classic book in the 1980s. And one of the things that his work did was that it argued for the essential element of story in understanding people's experiences of illness. And so Arthur Kleinman, he really distinguished between disease, right, as a discrete ailment that people suffer from, and illness, which is that whole experience of being unwell, right, just being unwell. And that illness, it includes that impact, how it shapes, how that disease impacts your identity, your relationships, your spiritual and philosophical view of the world, your ability to function in your job or in your family, just that whole impact on your life. Illness is the way disease impacts your whole self, right? And Kleinman also makes clear that when we're talking about healing, we're not talking about curing, right? Curing is removing a disease. Healing is restoring the whole person to a working identity, an identity that works. And so when we think about healing in that way, we can see that we're not just talking about healing an individual, but a person within their community. It's about restoring them to relationship, to themselves, to their family, to their natural environment, to their ancestors. And that kind of healing is possible even when you have a chronic disease that's not going to go away. That kind of healing is possible even when you're going to die. So when we think about stories and how that structures that, again, it makes me think of the story I started with, right? This story of Ellen Gray. I read her story for the first time 24 years ago, and it still sticks with me. And I think it's the absence of her story that really gets me the most. Because I don't know her real name. Ellen Gray is the name the school gave her. If there's anyone on this call who's from the Skokomish community, I would dearly love to learn her name. If there's some way we could do that, it would mean a lot to me. I don't know what she really felt or thought. She was so completely and lethally silenced. I don't know. I don't know what her mother or father felt. I don't know how her community grieved her loss. She didn't have a chance to reclaim her working identity. She didn't get a chance for healing. So when I think about her story and lack of story, and I think about that so much, I hope that the people who read my work and the students who take my classes leave being better equipped to seek out and genuinely hear other people's stories, to be better equipped to tell their own stories, and better able to challenge those assumptions about what it means to be well and who has a right to decide which stories matter and which stories don't. The image here is another Edward Curtis image. So the same young woman, I believe, that was in the first slide. Again, Edward Curtis provides a name, but I don't know if it's accurate. These images themselves are so problematic. I wanted to have an image there because it troubled me to have nothing. And yet here is a relative of Ellen Gray. And yet the absence of the information is so strong as well. Where is the story? Edward Curtis's photos were so powerful and yet also omitted so much. So I can stop sharing. There I am. Thank you so much.
I want to now invite our next speaker, who's Dr. Brenda Llewellyn Ihssen. Dr. Ihssen is Associate Professor of Early and Medieval Christian History, and her scholarship focuses on the ethics of patristic and Byzantine Christian sources. She's written extensively and really insightfully about how those sources shed light on subjects like economics and justice and healthcare and pain and suffering. She's also an expert on issues of pedagogy and particularly issues of disability and identity in the classroom. And I'm really interested in how some of these things come together in the talk she's going to give. Her title is Religious History and Mental Health, Strategies in Late Antique and Medieval Texts to Support Neurodivergent Health. So Brenda.
Thank you. Am I doing everything right so far here? In terms of, can you hear me? Can you see me? Yes, okay. All right, so let me screen share. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation, Tamara and the Wong Center, to participate in this event. So yes, my topic is religious history and mental health strategies in late antique and medieval texts to support neurodivergent health. I've heard already in the last two presentations several ways in which what the first two speakers have spoken about and what I have to speak about connect. And I love that this is how scholarship is done. One person says something, another person responds, and the next thing you know, you have an article or the next panel. When I received this invitation, there was a long list, and now my my thing won't go forward either. I apologize. This was the list that we received when we were asked to consider what we wanted to speak about. And so my presentation is going to address healing intersections with gender and creed, empathetic and healing disruptions in the disciplines and professions, self-care and healing, and then case studies. And I can't actually read the rest of it because the subtitles are covering it. It looks like case studies on effective strategies for healing. So there aren't really good histories of mental health, but if you take the histories of mental health that we do have from classical, late antique, and medieval sources, we have two conclusions that we can draw from the sources. And the first conclusion is that those whose behaviors are different are respected for their distinct and mysterious behavior. They are considered as having a special relationship with the divine, and therefore they are praised. Or they are persecuted for precisely the same thing. So that can be particularly challenging to work through. So what I want to talk about, my outline for you, is I would like to address first some of the healing challenges that we have in the sources, etiology, terminology, and so forth. I want to talk then briefly about dichotomies of healing in mental health care. I'd like to address specifically two cases and their strategies, and then I will have some conclusions. And I hope to do this all in the next 13 minutes. All right. So first of all, in terms of challenges, ancient etiology can really get in the way of understanding what's going on in the text. And here's where this issue of disease versus illness that Suzanne talked about kind of comes into play. For humoral healthcare, so the Hippocratic and Galenic healthcare, they viewed disease as a biological reality. In other words, it was something that happened within the body. Conversely, you have methods of healthcare that view illness or poor health as a deviation. So it's an invasion. It's something that is foreign to the body. When Christian healthcare practitioners are going to address in time issues of health and ill health, they're really going to love the Hippocratic approach, because the idea of deviation from the norm often is wrapped up with language around spirits and the demonic and whatnot. So we have these two ways of understanding health that can already muddy the waters. In terms of terminology, it gets even worse. There's not just two ways of understanding mental health. Here is a nice list of the various ways that mental health is described. You have melancholy, which is the most common. You have mania, which is often just sort of like melancholy plus. There's brain inflammation, lethargos or lethargy. My favorite is shagginess. I loved it when I was reading Paul of Angina, who writes about the shagginess of his patients. And many of these are words that we all recognize, of course. But the difficulty is, once these texts are translated into English, if we're not addressing them in their original language. So, for example, if we read Thomas Aquinas talking about sloth, it seems like he's just talking about somebody being lazy. Whereas he's not, he's speaking about depression. So the terminology can make it difficult for the student of these texts to interact with them. In terms of culture, culture is an important, as we know also from these first two presentations, culture is an important part of understanding mental health. But mental health isn't just simply a social construct. In addition to the culture within which certain behaviors are considered acceptable or not acceptable, it gets more complicated when you add religion into the mix. So I'm going to give you two examples of what I mean by that. There are certain behaviors that are considered acceptable within a religious environment that might seem problematic within a culture. Teresa of Avila here is pictured in this very famous statue of her in a state of religious ecstasy, which, depending on who you are and how you're looking at it, could look like she's falling asleep. It could look like sexual pleasure. It could look like sadness. Could look like any variety of things, but it's religious ecstasy. And what is religious ecstasy? Depends on who's defining it. Another example is Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard suffered from blinding pain in her head that was so strong that she would have to confine herself to a dark room where, despite no light, she would see flashes of light, she would hear voices, just moving her head hurt. And most of you recognize that what she was experiencing was a migraine. But these visions that she had during this pain, she painted them, she wrote them down. And so here we have a biological activity and a religious activity really just mirroring each other. So sort of teasing apart which is which can be difficult. And then the fourth challenge here is about the blurring of the clinical and moral views of the ill. Why would it be sort of natural that these various pieces of understanding health would be overlapping? Well, it would be natural because the medical marketplace wasn't just filled with doctors. The medical marketplace actually began with the person, right? So the person themselves is part of the marketplace, but then you consult your family, or you consult a divinity, or you consult a physician, or you consult a folk healer, and most likely you consult all of them. It was well known in the classical world, in antiquity, and in the Middle Ages that you have sometimes competitive, sometimes conflicting, but most often complementary sets of people working on various ailments. Irrespective of who is the practitioner and who is the patient, there's always going to be a hierarchy of cause and cure. And I spoke about this last year in actually the global health class that the Wong Center did. So this some of you might remember this, that irrespective of the setting, the patient, the physician, the healthcare practitioner, there's always going to be some view of cause that is given greater weight. So you might experience something and think that, okay, there are clear biological reasons why this is happening, but also why is this happening, right? What have I done? What aspect of my life have I lived improperly, or whom have I offended? In addition to the fact that I've cut my finger and I haven't cleaned it, right? So there's always this hierarchy at play. So I want to talk briefly before the case studies about the dichotomies of healing and mental health care. And there's 5 of them. First, there's the mind, soul, and the body dichotomy. It's not just a simple case of the mind and soul and the body are working against each other, or one is being privileged over the other. It's how they operate together that is viewed differently by both religious writers and non-religious writers. One of the best texts for working through this dualism is in Plato, where he writes in Timaeus rather optimistically, I have to say, no one wishes to be bad, but a bad man is bad, or a bad person is bad because of some flaw in their physical makeup, and failure as education, neither of which they like or they choose. So for Plato, right, this dualism between the mind and the body is linked in some way with things like a poor education or a poor home setting or poor food. And so there's going to be difficulty reconciling health if you have these other factors that are interfering with the body. As well, for Plato, you have the soul rooted in 3 different places in the body. You have it in the mind, which is the rational component. You have it in the heart, which is the emotional component. And then you have it in the body, which is subject to senses. So these are all sort of working through the tensions as they try to exist within one unit. A second dichotomy of healing in mental health care is cause, right? Is it a human cause or is it a malevolent force? And I mentioned again, Hippocratic medicine. It tends to favor human cause, right? There are not malevolent forces that are working against an individual, that if there are divine forces at work, they would be working for the good of an individual, not for their illness. But we can see examples of this dualism in a variety of sources. For example, in this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here we have an image of Ajax, who throws himself on his sword, right? After discovering that he has slaughtered, he has created unnecessary bloodshed. And does he fall on his sword because of an untempered ego, or is it because of Athena, right? Who goes in there and makes him mad. This lower image here is the Saul, right? Is Saul afflicted with jealousy, or does God give him a bad spirit, right? In which case, God is the malevolent force. And then this vase here shows us Medea, the famous Medea, on her chariot. Does she murder her children and then get in a chariot and fly away because of jealousy or hysteria? Or is it because Hecate has convinced her to do so, right? Is it their own fault, or is there something exterior to them that is making them act the way they do? A third dichotomy of healing in mental health care is control. And this is linked a little bit to the last one. Do people suffer from mental health because of something they've done or they choose to do? Or is it predetermined that that's who they are and that's how life is going to go for them? I want to just show you quickly 2 texts that really highlight this. In a very heartbreaking story from the New Testament, this is the account of the man afflicted by demons. And in the text, when the man saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For Jesus had said to the man, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked, "What is your name?" And the man replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." It's I think, one of the most chilling passages in Scripture. My name is Legion, for we are many. Right? So we have in this passage very clearly that this is not something within this man's control. On the other hand, we have this wonderful life of Saint Simeon of Emesa, known as a holy fool. And the text reads, "The manner of his entry into the city was as follows. When the famous Simeon found a dead dog on a dunghill outside the city, he loosened the rope belt he was wearing and tied it to the dog's foot. He dragged the dog as he ran and entered the gate, where there was a children's school nearby. When the children saw him, they began to cry, 'Hey, crazy Abba!' And they set about to run after him and box him on the ears." Now, he's very intentionally engaging in these behaviors that will make him be known as crazy, right? So it's under his control. It's his own free will. A fourth dichotomy of healing in mental health care in these texts is the distinction between scientific advancement and understanding human behavior and emotion. And really the quickest way to, and from an easiest way for me to understand this dichotomy is really thinking about the distinction between medication and how we understand people who are neurodivergent, right? So for example, if a person needs Zoloft, and if Zoloft is the cure, then in 6 to 8 weeks, so that's a pretty short span of time, but it takes a lot longer for people to understand how to live with or behave around or engage with people who might need Zoloft. I have 2 minutes left. Okay. So the last dichotomy in healing in mental health care texts is about treatment. And the dichotomy is the distinction between the punitive and the humane. So, and now my PowerPoint is not working. There we go. So to give you an example of the distinction between the two, Asclepiades in the 1st century before the Common Era writes that individuals who are neurodivergent should be treated by fasting, so controlled diet with rest, music, massage, baths, music, purgation, exercise, narcotics, and trephining, which is, releasing pressure in the skull. And you can see this person survived. We can see that their skull continued the bone continued to grow. Compare that to Celsus, who writes 200 years later that neurodivergents are best treated by certain tortures, by starvation, fetters, and flogging. Seems like healthcare is going backwards, right, in that way. So the 2 case studies that I thought about for this particular presentation and how people addressed strategies they used. One is John Chrysostom and the Deaconess Olympia. Their context was these were late 4th, early 5th century patriarchal Constantinople and Deaconess Olympia. They were friends. They were both exiled because they were viewed as having deviant views from their community. And the text, their strategy was they wrote letters to one another to comfort each other in their depression and in their exile. For example, one letter reads, "For the letters which you have sent to us through Patrikos have revealed the wounds of your heart and your mind." They are acknowledging the sadness. They're acknowledging how this has impacted them. And another example, "All was night, the day and the dawn, the height of noonday, and I spent the whole time nailed to my bed." I love that phrase, nailed to my bed. Being unable to move because of the sadness. So their strategy, writing, okay? The second case study that I'm just going to mention is that of Marjorie Kemp, and I will do this in 1 minute and wrap up. Her context is she's referred to as crazy or having suffered from postpartum depression. She was, every time, a 14th through 15th century brewer of beer, a fine brewer. She was English. She was deeply religious and desired agency. In the text, she is plagued with visions of demons, informed that God has deserted her, criticized and damned by her priest as a heretic. And she experiences social rejection, which leads to self-harm, wanderings, and uncontrollable tears. Marjorie's strategy is to flip the script. She says, actually, my crying is praying, so back off. And she engages in a technique of praying the Psalter, which is a small little, tiny little version of the Psalms, and then listening to the voices in her head and trusting them. So actually, I'm going to end there with listening to the voices in her head and trusting them. And all of my other conclusions will be available for you, I'm sure, in whatever resources are made available for you after this presentation. Dang.
Thank you so much, Brenda. That was fascinating, and I think I'm curious about your conclusions, but also really intrigued by the voices in all of our heads. So thank you so much. Much appreciated. And also appreciation to all of you joining us. And in case anybody came late, I just want to welcome you first to the Wong Symposium and this panel on healing in the disciplines, and also remind you that any questions, any responses that you want the panelists to consider when we have 10 or so minutes at the end, feel free to use the Q&A function, and feel free to list those, and we will address those that we can when we get to the end. We move now to our next panelist, Dr. Sarah Robinson. Dr. Robinson is Resident Assistant Professor of Religion here at PLU. She also serves the American Academy of Religion as Chair of the Ecology and Religion Unit of the Western Region, and on the steering committee of the National Religion and Food Unit. Sarah teaches and researches about the intersection of environment and food and religion, and pays comparative attention to Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. She recently published the book, Valuing Lives, Healing Earth, and she'll be drawing on that in her presentation, which is entitled Restoring Community Well-Being, Ecology, Gender, and Solidarity in Valuing Lives, Healing Earth. So Sarah, I turn it to you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And thank you to the organizers of today's symposium. It really is an honor to be here with you. Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share my screen so I can offer a slideshow. Here you go. So here is the title of the book that I and 3 of my colleagues have put together. We were editing a volume of essays and working in a global way to understand what healing looks like when it combines the sense of community healing with environmental healing, with particular attention to people who suffer most in a variety of communities around the world. And for this reason, we were looking with particular attention to gendered experiences. So here are the 4 of us as we were celebrating and announcing the book at the Parliament of World Religions last year. And there were 18 chapter authors that we highlighted in that presentation. I won't have a chance to talk about all of the authors, but I will give you a taste of at least one chapter from each of the 4 sections of the book. So out of the submissions that we received, 4 themes emerged: knowledge, ritual, activism, and food as particularly salient ways to bring together these varying experiences from around the world. We were looking at essays from scholars with experience as well as with research experience in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and North America. So some of the scholars were from those areas. Some of the scholars were coming from a different area and studying in one of these areas. And we welcomed their case studies, understanding contemporary religious, environmental, and gendered contexts around the world. Some of the priorities that we identified in our introduction to the book, we're looking not only to amplify voices as a move to build further justice, amplifying voices of people who don't get heard adequately in their own communities. And so not only to bring attention to them in a local space, but also in a global space of highlighting their stories through academic discourse. By amplifying voices, we were also looking to highlight the value of diversity and inclusion, which comes up in conversations in many university contexts. Disinfecting sunshine, that was the term that we came up with to talk about some of these elements of good governance that can be helpful in worldwide contexts, bringing transparency, meaning more information, more capacity to see and understand what people's on-the-ground experiences are, as well as how that transparency can directly relate to accountability. So that will make more sense as I talk more about the case studies directly. But another of the pieces of that puzzle is to think about the role of the scholar. And the four of us, as we were talking as editors about the book, we realized that what we were doing was really to try to inhabit mutual solidarity, both with our various authors to the book, but also with the people in the communities around the world that they were studying and highlighting the voices of. So looking at people who are suffering in various ways and looking at those interactions and interconnections between human suffering and environmental health. So just to further understand what solidarity looks like on a human scale, we talked about it as a moral priority for those who suffer most, and thinking about with whom people can be in solidarity, by whom is solidarity given, and for whom can solidarity be arranged. And in this way, thinking about building coalitions across differences, as well as building coalitions among people who may be in different parts of the world, but may have some very common experiences, not identical experiences, but common enough to build coalitions around them. And again, this has the potential, and we were hoping and continue to hope that this work can then move towards reducing colonial impositions and facilitating this sort of transparency around situations where there's oppression, corruption, misuse of privilege and power, and be in a space with these authors and these communities to invite reflection on renewing living communities. So the first section of the book, I have the authors and the titles here. I won't describe all of them, but I just wanted to note them for you so you can at least see them. And I'll talk about two of these articles that are in the knowledge section. Ivone Gabara is coming from Brazil. She's a Latin American Catholic nun and ecofeminist theologian, and her article talks about how pollution through the waste cycle is not just polluting the environment, it is polluting the bodies of specific people. And she says trash is a problem because whoever produces it leaves it for others to take care of. And this task is usually given to women and especially the poor. And in the case study that she's offering, she talks about African Brazilian women who are picking waste from waste piles to look for usable things as well as recyclables to gain some income when they have very few opportunities for income. So Gabara is bringing her international acclaim and position. Through that, she is bringing attention to the poorest of the poor in her area. Lillian Dubé, my co-editor of the book, also wrote a chapter for it. She's a professor at the University of San Francisco, and her rootedness is in Zimbabwe, her home country. And she talks about enslavement and the trees under which revolutionary leaders in her country were martyred. And she talks about the slavery and colonialism being complicating the relationship of people, God, and the earth. And one of the fascinating things, although this is a very rich article, one of the fascinating things she brings up is the capacity within Zimbabwe of celebrating revolutionary leaders under the trees where they were martyred. So human bodies were lynched under these trees, and yet these trees are re-envisioned as spaces of memorializing important leaders in the community.
The second section of the book is on ritual. We have the 4 authors and 4 essay titles here. I'll again just talk about one of them, just to give you a taste of what is happening in this book, to talk about healing in context here. So Sylvia Marcos is working in Mexico, and she's looking at Mesoamerican Indigenous studies. She charts some resonance between early contact documentation of medical practices in what is now Mexico to contemporary case study research that she does with Indigenous women healers, curanderas, in specific communities in Mexico. And so she talks in her article, she says the article shows how we can approach Indigenous medicine, respecting and appreciating it within its own complex epistemic universe of interconnection, interdependence, and symbolic action. You can see some resonance between what Sylvia Marcos is saying and what several of my colleagues have also said about the importance of seeing the body and its health in relation to the field of beyond simply this sort of instrumental understanding to, in this case, she highlights a sense of cosmology, a universe of meaning in which bodies exist, and how the medical practices of Indigenous communities continue some of this knowledge through ritual. And the activism section of the book has a variety of wonderful authors offering highlights. And here is the author that I'd like to highlight for you today. Aruna Gnanadasan is writing from India. She is a leader in the World Council of Churches and a theologian in her own right. And she writes about an earth-friendly God as a God of compassion who has profound reverence toward life, empathy towards those who suffer, and concern for the flourishing of all beings. So she's inviting a reflection on healing that again has to do with this intersection between the health of people with other living beings and the earth itself, and that this is a relational ethic that she is referring to with empathy and reverence for others. The last section of the book highlights food and agriculture, and a variety of authors and messages here, but I'll again just highlight one of them. Adrienne Crone is writing from Canada. She writes in Jewish studies, and she is looking here at a contemporary community program called Shorish Jewish Environmental Programs and how they work with pollinator restoration. She also mentions biblical accounts of bees and honey and rabbinical discussions of illness treatment using honey as treatment for illness. And so she cites these interconnected elements of health between the health of the bees, the health of agriculture, and the health of human beings. She's saying, in a quotation from her essay, "The bees are dying, and once people learn about it, it is hard not to care." So she, again, highlights this capacity to eat for human beings being linked to agricultural health and health of pollinators, and thus the religious ethical priority of the community that she's studying is to restore pollinator health as this interconnected health with human beings as well. So coming back to some of the themes of the book, what decisions shape a community? How does community cohesion and democratic participation relate to resilience? This is something I really highlight also in the classes that I teach at PLU on religion and the environment. Whose voices must be heard more clearly in order to attend to these crucial moral tasks of earth, climate, and inclusive community care? And how can community responsiveness be timely and locally appropriate? One of the things that comes up in conversations about global health and global gendered well-being is asking the question of what is needed according to the people that are suffering. So in order to be of service or offer solidarity, to be able to identify what not only we might colonially say, you must have this, but rather listen to what people are saying that they truly need at the local level. So again, just going over some of the things that I highlighted in the presentation. Urdangarain talks about garbage as the waste cycle polluting bodies and environments, and particularly women's bodies, and particularly African heritage women's bodies in Brazil being subject to the pollution of garbage. And Lillian Dubé, rooted in Zimbabwe and working in the United States, talks about enslavement and movements towards revolution in her home country, and the trees where revolutionary leaders were martyred, and understanding not only these elements of remembrance and memorializing, but how those memorials reflect an understanding of selfhood and well-being in the age of, for example, the AIDS crisis in Zimbabwe and in Africa more generally, as well as the COVID-19 crisis in Africa. So Silvia Marcos in Mexico talks about indigenous medicine systems from colonial period through the present, and compares these elements of having a cosmological view, an epistemic universe that is part of the healing that happens for, or the meaning in the healing being just as important, or having a central role in the healing process. Aruna Gnanadasan, as a theologian, a Christian theologian in India, talks about the God of compassion and invites reflection on caring about suffering people and the earth. And then Adrian Crone, coming from a Jewish perspective in Canada, is writing about a local community, Shoresh, where they are balancing human health with bee health and agricultural health. And just to finish, another of the quotations from our introduction, solidarity is not abstract, but rather emerges through life-giving activities which mend the fabric of life. And this theme, I hope, is apparent through the descriptions I've offered of these essays that are highlighted today, and the rest of the essays as well. And just since we're working in a global studies forum, I've added another quotation from the founder of the World Resources Institute, the co-founder of Natural Resources Defense Council, the former administrator of the United Nations, or a former administrator at the United Nations Development Program and professor of law at Vermont Law School. James Gustav Speth says, the most fundamental transition is the transition in culture and consciousness. So this is a scientist and legal professional who's highlighting the need to address environmental health issues by addressing culture and consciousness. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and thank you again for the invitation to be part of this panel.
And thank you, Sarah, so much for the presentation and so much food for thought and so much I want to follow up on and keep reading about. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for being with us. We have one more speaker who I'm very excited to introduce to you, and then we'll have a few minutes left for some conversation. So I'll invite Dr. Giovanna Urdangarain, who is Associate Professor of Hispanic Studies. Giovanna is an expert on memory and trauma studies, and her research attends particularly to post-dictatorial narratives that have been produced in the Southern Cone, which includes Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina. Her studies of literature and film and other media offer us a lot of insight into how people deal with violence, how people represent gender, and how the two interact. And I'm very much looking forward to learning from her. The title of her talk is Southern Cone State Terrorism and the Question of Healing. Giovanna, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everybody for being here, and also for the invite to the panel. I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn so much from my colleagues, which I have done already, so I'm really appreciative of that. As Kevin was mentioning, I will be talking about healing and memory in the Southern Cone. Both my research and part of my teaching at PLU address the ways in which the southernmost region of Latin America has worked through the impact and the legacy of the state terrorism it suffered during the 1970s and 80s. I'm talking about the so-called Southern Cone, the South American region comprising Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay, and the military alliance code-named Operation Condor, established among the right-wing regimes ruling those countries at the time. This alliance was devised as a transnational plan to repress, kidnap, disappear, and assassinate political opponents across international borders. And while the term Southern Cone limits its scope to these 4 countries, Brazil and Bolivia were also members of this operation. Following the transition to democratic rule in each country, the last of which was Paraguay in 1989, the region embarked on a process of forming their social memory about their dictatorial past. And when analyzing this process, I work with sources that are mostly artistic in nature. Specifically, I study cultural production through literary and cinematographic texts. The emergence and evolution of these cultural products has seemingly revealed 2 central common characteristics. On the one hand, they continue to operate as a crucial part of collective efforts toward justice, yet on the other, they have played a fundamental role in expanding the discourses about the region's past. The narration of the past has become increasingly inclusive and now more than ever incorporates accounts about different experiences within this historical period from people of different ages, social backgrounds, and gender identities. Considering this increasing inclusivity, defining the narration of the past, and the dynamic nature of memory in shaping how we remember events individually and collectively, we can think of cultural production as a set of attempts to provide healing at a societal level. Although memory and trauma studies are the interdisciplinary fields at the heart of my research, I will analyze the discourses of healing we'll discuss today through the lens of my training as a literary scholar. As I thought about what I would share with you today, I realized that colleagues in memory and trauma studies who view these examples of cultural production do not necessarily or explicitly label them as healing. Nevertheless, when we look at the very reason these artistic expressions exist and the impact they have on the society they represent, it seems not only possible, but appropriate to conceptualize them as a form of healing with characteristics unique to this particular socio-political context. 2 questions arise. Does the very idea of healing change in this context? If we can agree that it does, in fact, change, how is it different? I ask you to join me in reflecting on these questions as we explore a few specific examples of cultural production. And in our short time together, I aim to, 1, share a few examples of artistic, intellectual, social projects, what I would call social gestures that can be seen as healing, and 2, comment on a specific literary example that demonstrates how studying this type of sources has the potential to contribute to the process of social healing. Additionally, I would argue that when discussing healing in this context, I'm implicitly conceptualizing it in 5 ways. Healing as a political act, healing as a form of labor, healing as a process that is both progressive and regressive, healing as something that is never complete, but always possible, even from positions of radical vulnerability, such as women who have experienced sexual violence. And finally, healing as a part of justice and vice versa. So for the sake of time, I'm not gonna talk too much about the first example I wanted to mention. Probably you have heard of this organization. I'm just gonna mention that this organization has done monumental work over the course of the last 42 years in recovering 130 grandchildren between 1978 and 2019 who had been kidnapped. Their work has been a steady, inspiring tribute to hope and love that only paused for the first time during the COVID-19 pandemic. And their work will hopefully regain traction as in-person activities return to normal. The second example I wanted to show you and share with you is Ausencias, Absences by Gustavo Germano. It's a photographic project created in 2006 to record memory in Argentina. Let me minimize this because I think I'm not allowing people to see. The project has since expanded to include Brazil in 2012 and Uruguay in 2017. Much as the grandmothers represented both a personal and collective longing for answers, Germano's project is both personal and collective. His brother Eduardo was one of the victims of Operation Condor, and his digital albums highlight the human rights violations carried out during this period by showing, as you can see on the images, the striking impact of the loss of life, not just for those close to the disappeared, but also for the social spaces to which those people were once connected. I think I'm experiencing the same thing my colleagues experienced before. Okay, now it's working. With this project, Germano was able to reinscribe in the social imaginary the fight for justice and reformulate the need to continue the fight. That's why I'm bringing this example today in the context of a conversation on healing. His project emerged at a time when the youngest Argentinians were beginning to show signs of saturación de memoria, or memory saturation. That is, the abundance of discourses on the recent past was beginning to prevent youth from listening to or engaging in the topic. Germano's unique approach to documenting Argentina's past kept the conversation on social justice alive, confronting new audiences with an undeniable visualization of the impact of loss in a present that belonged to everybody, and from which no one could claim being excluded. Historias Desobedientes is the third example. It is a collective founded in 2017. The members of Historias Desobedientes are relatives, primarily daughters and grandchildren, of those who perpetrated crimes against humanity during the dictatorial period. They are united under an ethical position that condemns the actions of their fathers and grandfathers. And this position is evident from the name they've chosen for themselves, which explicitly signals a rejection to abide by the order or military and orders given by the military, while claiming their right to their own place and voice in history. The novelty of this intervention in the process of forming of social memory for this period in about Argentina's past lies in two central areas. First, it illuminates a less studied dimension of the intergenerational legacy of those who perpetrate crimes against humanity, and in so doing, allows us to identify and consider unexpected, useful alliances emerging among social subjects previously assumed to be antagonistic. The members of Historias Desobedientes add their voices and physical presence to demonstrations and other forms of social demands about human rights, previously only led by descendants of direct victims. In the second place, it reveals signs of healing in a way that differs from what the fight for justice has been in the almost 5 decades following authoritarianism. The relatives of those who perpetrated these crimes choose to distance themselves emotionally, physically, and legally from their ancestors' crimes by requesting a legal name change based on their moral opposition to their relatives. They also label themselves publicly as former children of the perpetrators. As a result of this redefinition of their familial ties, they emphasize their adherence to democracy and choose to stand side by side with the other collectives that have been fighting for justice all these years. In academic circles, some have warned that coupling the stories of the children of victims and perpetrators of crimes against humanity may violate a frontier between vastly different traumatic experiences. Nevertheless, the fact that this collective came to exist as a result of their commitment to justice and truth makes it possible in the Argentine context to envision a more promising socio-political landscape when it comes to discussing and working through the legacy of violence the country has endured. Now I would like to invite you to join me in looking in depth at one specific example. When considering the potential of literature to operate as an instrument for raising awareness about a social justice issue, and in turn possibly functioning as a healing tool, the case of the novel A Secret for Julia by Argentine novelist and lawyer Patricia Sagastizabal comes to mind. Published in 1999 and translated into English 2 years later, this text confronts the readers with what was a significantly understudied topic about state terrorism in the Southern Cone at the time. As the title suggests, this novel centers on the titular secret, the sexual violence inflicted on Julia's mother while held captive as a dissident. The topic of sexual violence against women as a systematic form of torture during Operation Condor was still an understudied topic a decade ago. Maternity as a result of rape by military officers, the challenges associated with motherhood resulting from those abject circumstances, and the challenges faced by a child born from such a violent act remain understudied today. When I decided to work with Sagastizabal's novel in my doctoral dissertation back in 2007, I was interested in studying the ways in which female bodies were portrayed in a literary production resulting from a violent historical period. After hearing the novel's plot, my advisor asked if the story told by the novel was based on true events. No other text in the region, even if it addressed sexual violence explicitly, touched on this topic. The only reference I could find that documented the reality of this experience was a Chilean report entitled Memories of Occupation, published in Santiago in 2005. Journalist Cecilia Yañez commented on the report in her column at the newspaper La Nación at the time, writing, and I quote, "Among the 3,399 women who had given testimony in front of the National Commission on Torture and Political Prison, more than half had been in detention centers in 1973. Almost all of them confirmed having been subjected to sexual violence. 316 reported having been raped. 13 became pregnant as a result of those violations, and 6 of those pregnancies came to term." End of quote. While there is much to say about why this last experience was and still is, for the most part, silenced, the reason I share the reference today in the context of a discussion on healing is precisely because it reveals the power of fiction as an artistic human expression to unveil difficult, unconfronted social issues and allow them to reach a much larger audience than a report with true testimonials ever did. While there are records of female political prisoners stating that being able to see their experiences represented on film, for example, had a therapeutic impact on them, there is no evidence of the women in Chile having read Sagastizabal's novel, and we can only speculate on the possibility of readers in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, who might have lived or heard of the experience the novel told. What we do know, however, is that once the story told by the novel entered the archive of memory discourses on what the region had gone through, it gave voice to an experience of victimhood that continued to be swept under the rug 4 decades later. The publication of this novel and the story it told provided the first indispensable step required in any healing process, whether individual or collective, the recognition that a traumatic experience had happened. To conclude, I would like to recenter our discussion originally in 3 of the propositions I shared for conceptualizing healing in the political and geographical context I share today. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to move straight to the 3rd one. Healing as something that is never complete, but is always possible, even from positions of radical vulnerability. I would like to end today by saying that even under the constraints of amnesty laws, or when judicial moves attempted to erase what had been achieved in the pursuit of justice, people found a way to counteract those limitations. They invented a new form of justice within the regional and historical context, and a new language to go along with it. The verb funar in Chile and escrachar in Argentina and Uruguay describe a public form of justice that consists of demonstrating in front of perpetrators' houses or workplaces so that their neighbors and co-workers would know of the crimes they had committed and for which they had never been sentenced. When there was neither governmental support nor sufficient funding to build a museum of memory, a group of Paraguayans managed to design a virtual museum that ended up teaching the country's past, not only their citizens, but to people worldwide. When the members of Historias Desobedientes could not testify in court against their parents because the Argentinian Criminal Procedure Code contains 2 articles preventing spouses and close relatives to do so, they started working on writing a bill to change the code. People continue fighting to heal from the legacy of Operation Condor through radical change. These examples demonstrate that despite the inherent complexity of recovering from atrocities committed at a massive scale for a number of years in a vast Latin American region, the commitment to healing remains strong at the core of all those societies, both as a work in progress and as a compilation of successful political endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. Really helpful, and I so appreciate both the specificity and the power of those narratives, and also your conclusions and the way you draw that out.